Welcome to Catalytic Leadership, the podcast designed to help leaders intentionally grow and thrive. Here is your host, author, and leadership and executive coach, Dr. William Attaway.
Hey, it's William, and welcome to today's episode of the Catalytic Leadership Podcast. Each week, we tackle a topic related to the field of leadership. My goal is to ensure that you have actionable steps you can take from each episode to grow in your own leadership. I believe, like Craig Rochelle has said many times, that when a leader gets better, everybody benefits. Your team, your department, your customers, your clients, your spouse, your kids, everybody. Each week, we spotlight leaders from a variety of fields, locations, and organizations. My goal is for you to see that leaders can be catalytic no matter where they are or what they lead. I draw inspiration from the stories and journeys of these leaders, and I hear from many of you that you do too. Let's jump in to today's interview. It is an incredible honor and a joy to have Kristin Chadwick on the show today. Kristin has been in the podcasting industry since 2016, helping coaches, authors, and influencers launch and grow their podcast and expand their business. She brings a unique personalized approach through utilizing coaching tools to help bring alignment, purpose, and intention to their podcast. She also hosts two of her own podcasts, Wholistic Podcasting for Podcasters, one of my favorites, and Wholistic Hearts, a podcast to help people encounter the heart of Jesus through the art of using our imagination. Kristin, it is such a joy to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be a part of your podcast because, we all need more just wisdom and insight into how to be great leaders. So I appreciate you having me here.
Well, I would love to start by you sharing some of your story with our listeners, particularly around your journey and your development as a leader. Kristin, how did you get started?
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to say that my journey as a leader really has developed over time. I think the moment I became a mom was the very first moment I felt that inner stirring of like, oh, we're in charge of this thing. Okay. Nobody's going to really tell me what to do. That would be the very first moment I really felt that leadership. And yes, there were times, in college where I felt like I wanted to lead a group, but I don't know if I really started feeling that ownership of I am leading someone else until I became a mom. And then really my journey in that specifically was really a place where I got to the end of myself of thinking that I really didn't trust my own voice for so long. And I was really at a place of desperation. And it all started really with crying out to God and being like, I am at the end of myself and I need you. And so I had this really amazing encounter with a friend who really took me on a journey as a woman of discovering who I was and who I was as a mom, but more so who I was in God himself. And so that was the turning point of like, oh, I actually have an identity that is very specific to me. And I am my 4 kids' mom for a reason. Yeah. And I am quirky and creative and love producing random things for a reason, and starting to see that, oh, those were actually gifts uniquely given to me by my creator. And so the more that I really stepped into knowing more about my creator, the more that I learned about myself. And that in itself really started this whole journey of leadership. And I don't know if I've ever really called it leadership, but I think it really is leadership when you start to understand your own kingdom identity, because then you understand your mission and your purpose, and not only your being, but you're now starting to operate out of that place and be a light into this world. So really, as I stepped more into knowing who I was really a turning point for me. Um, and I say that because I think that's really when I woke up to, oh, I'm influencing my children. I'm influencing my husband. I'm influencing my friends that I usually am the background person, but now people are watching me and what I'm doing. Not out of I'm forging forward as a leader, like not in that sense, but it was like I'm going after my heart and going after who God is, and I'm going after what He's created me to do with a passion, and in that discovering, in that healing and coaching and counseling and all of those opportunities was really when I began to hear other people say things like, you really are showing us how to walk this out. Or I remember I don't know why I'm bringing this up, but this one guy that I went to a conference, and he came up to me and he was like, I just want to tell you that God thinks you're an incredible mother, and you're going to be such an encouraging person to many mothers. And I was like, what? I mean, it was so out of the blue, but it stirred something in me to be like, oh, God has people around me to watch and for me to glean from, and for them to glean from, of like, hey, this is where the beautiful work is of really discovering who we are and who we're called to be. And that in turn inspires others to figure out who they are, and who they are created to be, and to do what they're called to do. So there.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Oh. And I love where you went there. You know, the people around you who see and speak into your life.
Yes.
You know, there's a sense sometimes that the leadership is lonely, and I get that. There's a sense sometimes that, it's lonely at the top, you're all by yourself. I get that. I get all of the things around that. But the fact of the matter is, we have people around us for a purpose, who can speak encouragement into us, who can sometimes speak a word of exhortation, or even a prophetic word, like you got saying, hey, this is what God says about you. This is what he thinks about you. I remember what Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, once said. Actually, he said it many, many times. He said, you want to know how to tell if somebody needs encouragement? If they're breathing.
That's awesome.
And I thought, what a brilliant leadership insight, and what a great practice for every leader to take. And I love how, like, your journey was affected by somebody who did that.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Words are so important. And I mean, in every area of big catalyst moments has been somebody else speaking to something inside of me. And so now, as a coach, as a podcaster, oh man, that is the cry of my heart, is to speak that encouragement of calling out the gold in people that they don't quite see yet. Or like, for example, in my own story, my friend who came alongside of me and was like, hey, there's so much more to following Jesus than what you're experiencing. And you are called to bring that into your family. And this was back when, I don't know if I had ever heard anybody say, you are called to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. And she just reeled that in of like, Kristin, you have the light of Jesus in you. When you walk into that living room and you've got 4 crying kids, like, it's up to you to change the atmosphere. And if I didn't have her kind of stoking that flame and curiosity of like, what are you talking about? Like, I there's more to just writing down the right answers in my Bible study. Like, I can have a relationship in real time while I'm mothering four babies, basically, and it can change the whole dynamic of our living room. Okay, let's try this out. Like, that word and encouragement was what I needed in that time period fast forward to more of my professional life of having somebody come and this story is always such a cool story, and it really is a beautiful catalyst story. I thought I wanted to go back to school for counseling, and the last minute I pulled out and was like, I don't have a piece about it quite yet. And the next couple days later, a good friend of mine, Ryan Dobson, called and was like, hey, so we're going to be breaking away from my dad's show on the radio, and we want to start our own podcast. It's going to be called Rebel Parenting, and we want you to produce the show. And I was like, what are you saying? I don't even know what you're saying. What is a podcast? Like, I know of a podcast. I listened to a couple. I mean, this was 2016, so it was still baby podcast world. And he was like, oh, Kristin, you're built to be a podcast producer. It's already in you. And just to have him see something in me that I didn't see yet was a game changer for me, because I was able to really catch on, even though I was like, what are you saying? I was able to jump into the deep end with him and his wife, and we built this podcast that went from nothing to top 20 within a year, and learned so much. But the point of that is he saw in me what I didn't see in myself yet in that journey. And then a year after we started that, he started to say, Kristin, I want you to come and speak on the mic. And I was like, nope, I am the book reader. I am the guest scheduler. And he was like, no, I want you to come on the mic. And he was so kind. I mean, he was like, all I want you to do is just say like, I agree with you, or I don't agree with you. I mean, just very little conversation. And then it turned into a whole segment with Laura, his wife. And we would do shows back and forth where I mean, it was like we were the show. And so it went from like, I do not want to be behind the mic to now we're doing a show. And then eventually in 2020, we were like, okay, I think we're all parting ways. And Kristin, it sounds like you have a podcast ready to produce yourself. And then I launched my first podcast. And so, I think just having those people that see you have something to say and you have a story to bring to the table is so important as a leader, to continually just hone in on those things that you see. And maybe you have thought it, but you haven't verbally said it out loud. Like say it to the people that are around you, because you never know what's going to click in their brain of like, oh, I think I'm supposed to do something more than what I'm doing right now. So yes, voice is everything.
Well, speaking of that, how do you learn to discover your own voice?
Yeah, so that journey really was a lot of what I learned on Rebel Parenting. It was a lot of reading. I was telling him, my fellow book lover, we both have a million books in our office. And reading through so many different authors, well-known authors. I mean, we would get at least 10 books a week in our office when I was a producer for them. And so it was my job to skim through all of these books and be like, this is golden. We need to interview this person. And what I learned in those 4 years was my brain was totally constipated with information. That's what it was like, an absolute overload of, wow, there's so much info in my brain. I don't know what to do with that all. And number 2, nothing could touch my own experience the way that I could touch my own experience. So in particular, it was a marriage and family centered podcast. So I read all the marriage and family podcasts, but nothing would go after the heart of my own family the way that my time with Jesus and learning to hear my own voice and intuition with my husband than any other book. Like there's so much great knowledge. There's so much great wisdom. I love reading people's thoughts and their opinions. And when we get down to it, the quietness of our own heart is what's going to be the determining factor of what's true in our family. So with all of that, and what I always say is, you got to do your work. You got to do your own heart work. You got to know who your false self is, your true self is. You got to know who you are as a new creation, and really understanding what is that voice within you. So you heard me say, like, I would rather be behind the mic. So that is my default, is I would much rather be quiet, observe. And when I started to really lean into my kingdom identity, knowing who I am, I learned, oh gosh, all of this information that's in my brain, all this inner work that I'm doing in my own heart, through the counseling and coaching and all of that, it all is going to come together, and I get to share that experience. So the discovering of my own voice started with that segment on Rebel Parenting, Moms in the Mic, where I had my best friend next to me, and that was safe, like having my best friend there, and we could banter back and forth and talk about mom life. And then it slowly began to, like, I need to continue to speak what I'm actually experiencing and what I've learned over the last couple of years. And then the more that I did it, the more comfortable I began being behind the mic on my own show. And even just yesterday, I was interviewing Ryan, who I was originally, asked to be his producer. And we were just talking about how funny it is to see ourselves, back in 2016 versus now. And just thinking about how shy I was, and how now, even after all these years of both of us learning how to use our own voice, that we're still learning. It's still a push. It's still, okay, how do I want to present myself, and how do I do this without putting on a mask of, I got my stuff together, or this is my radio voice. Like, I am, hi, welcome. This is Kristin Chadwick when I'm having a really crappy day. Like, how do you get that real voice out there? And it's a constant practice of doing it over and over again. And it made me laugh, because he was like, I'm like, oh, that was too radio. Like, I'm Ryan Dobson. And so I'll turn on Wu-Tang and go like rap it out. And then I'll come back and be like, okay, I'm Ryan. I was like, oh, that's so like good to hear, because yes, we're constantly learning, right? And I think that's what makes a good leader, is that we've never arrived. We're constantly learning, and we're constantly learning to use our own voice. We're constantly learning how to do this well, better. Yeah.
So well put. I think part of a great leader is that continual learning posture, that teachable spirit. What are some all-time favorite game changer books that you have read that you would recommend that our listeners read?
Oh, goodness. Okay. First is The Gift of Being Yourself by David Benner. It is one of my all-time favorites. When I talked about learning about your true self, that is totally out of that book. It talks a lot about what's the difference between your true self, your false self, knowing your shadow, and then really pulling it all together. And in the beauty of it all intertwined is where God loves us and sees us. And so The Gift of Being Yourself. Let's see, my second. Oh man, I have so many, but I would say Abide. I'm totally dry. Abide in Christ by Tozer is one of my all-time favorites. Only because it really dives into I am the vine and you are the branches. That one just is like a go-to over and over again. And man, I have so many. It's hard to pick. Oh gosh, it's just tough. You put me on the spot.
Those are great. Those are fantastic. So, you balance motherhood and entrepreneurship. And I know a lot of listeners struggle with that, trying to balance, being a spouse, being a parent, being an entrepreneur, because all three of those can take over your life and take 100% of your time, energy, and effort.
Yeah.
What would you say to listeners who are having trouble there, who are having trouble struggling to balance those things?
I would say it's totally normal to struggle. I think that it's just part of, having a business, being in the midst of growing up kids, like no matter if they're toddler or they're high school, middle school. And I truly think in my own experience, and everybody has their own journey, but in my own experience, I thrive off of being able to step into my purpose, not only in my family, but outside of my family as well. And my kids know that. My husband knows that. And, excuse me, the word balance, I would say it's more of a synergy of making sure you communicate well. That has been a big thing. I communicate to my kids. When I don't communicate, there can be a lot of like tension, and I'm very particular about stopping once they're home from school. It's very important to me. And that is one of my values. So if you know your values, then you can really decide what's yes and what's no at this time. And it might be different values in different seasons. So right now, my value is to be present with my kids once they're home. And they may be like, peace out, mom, I got to do homework, or I'm going to go play Fortnite or Rocket League or whatever. But I'm here and available for them in this season. Now, as far as the synergy, the communicating with my husband, we both have this beautiful understanding of like some days he's going to need more time at work than I do, and that's great. And then there are some days where I'm like, hey, even though I work at home, I need you to be available to pick up the kids after school or take to soccer or to be home. And, to be really honest, because I feel like this isn't talked about very much, is that so we have a higher needs kiddo that that can make our day very needs to be more flexible. And so communication. And that's why I brought that up, was like some days there are days where I have to ask my husband to be like, hey, I need you to work from home today because I really need to get this done. And I'm going to be out of the house, unavailable. Just as much as flip flop of like, hey, I know you have a very busy day today. I got it. We're all good. But if there's not a clear communication, then it's going to be hard. So communicating is key for sure.
That's so good. And that's, that reflects my own experience as well. I mean, my wife and I we have two daughters. This is her freshman year in college. One is a high school sophomore, and every season is different and every season is hard. Preschool years were hard. These years are hard. They're just different hard.
Yes,
but
totally
the one constant is there has to be consistent, frequent communication to coordinate who's doing what by when. If we can answer that every week and sometimes every day, like, okay, who's where, who's doing what, just leaving those lines open, that is so important to creating a sense of, okay, are we in a healthy spot? Or are we leaning too far in one direction or another?
Right. And I would say too with that, like we can fall into that temptation where that's all we talk about is the by what, by when, who needs to go here, da, 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 da. And it's so easy to fall into that trap, but like remembering that it's relationship first, right? And so being sure to schedule that in as we are planners, scheduling those times into our calendar, because that's what we value, right? We value that connection with our family.
Our calendar needs to reflect our values. That's exactly it. Do we have a date night? Are we being intentional about not just talking about the logistics of life?
Yes.
So
Yes.
good. And I think for entrepreneurs, I mean, for all of us, we struggle with that because it bleeds, right? It bleeds into every part of our life, and it's so easy for it to just overtake everything. I want to talk about podcasting. This is what you do. You coach podcasting and you host several podcasts. This is something that a lot of people, I mean, obviously, if they're listening to this, they listen to podcasts. But the idea of launching one, starting one, like it's so overwhelming that they say, I don't know if I could ever do that. It's changed so much. I mean, when I first started producing a podcast for the church that I served back in the year 2000, it was very, very different. I had to code to be able to like put things on the internet, right? It's a whole different ballgame today. And yet it's still overwhelming. What would you say to somebody who's really struggling there? Like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have anything to say. How do I even launch this? How do I even get started?
Yeah. Oh, such a good question. And okay, first, I would say that it's a lot easier than you think it is at this point in time. I mean, there's so much more user-friendly things that you can do to produce a podcast on your own. You can do it yourself. You can meet with a coach and figure out what you need to do. Like that's what I do. You can hire somebody to help you launch a podcast. Man, it is overwhelming, but it is when you sit down and you think about your why. Why do you want to start a podcast? Who do you want to talk to? And what value are you bringing? Those are the three things that I usually ask is why, who's it for, and what value are you bringing to the table? And then from there, we can talk about all those little actionable steps that you can do to start recording and producing your podcast. So like, okay, so what kind of mic do I get? What kind of headphones? Where do I record? Do you put it somewhere online? And yes, to all of that. So, yep. I mean, there's so much we could talk about there, but the biggest thing is don't let the overwhelm stop you. Like if you feel that tug in your heart of, I feel like I need to start a podcast, but I'm overwhelmed. If it's but I feel afraid, overwhelmed, scared, then let's have a conversation. I mean, you can talk to you. I mean, that's a great step for anybody to come on here and talk to you or to talk to me. I'd be happy to help. But I would say if the overwhelm is stopping you, then I would check in with yourself and be like, okay, is that legitimate? Or is it something that I just can do step by step by step? And it's an elephant and you just need to break it down into bite-sized pieces because I promise you it's easier than you think.
When I started listening to your show, goodness, some 6-8 months ago now, I heard you talk about the value and the benefit of having a podcast manager. That was a new concept for me. I had never heard of that. And I heard you talk about that. I would love for you to share a little bit about the benefit of that. Like, what is the benefit of having someone else to manage your podcast?
So this is so important, I believe. If you are a coach, an entrepreneur, network marketer, ministry leader, here's the thing. Most people who start a podcast, they want to share their story, their heart. They want to share what they've learned. They want to lead well. And that is where their energy is. They're creative, right? So if you have the energy there, we only have so much energy. And then you get into the recording and then you're like, well, now I have to edit it. So that's going to take an extra moment of your time or so. And then you have to do all the technical stuff. Well, that kind of kills your buzz, right? Like you just put all of this like heart inspired content out there. And now you have to sit down and edit, which in my experience, most people who are creators, the editing and the technical side of things is where it is totally not their jam. So then it becomes, they look at the editing and the technical side of it. And then they say, well, I don't want to record because I don't want to do that. And so that's where podcast management comes in, is that we come alongside and we let you stay focused on where you're called to be focused, which is creating that content, being a leader out there, showing your value. And then we take it, all you would do is record, send it to us, and then we take care of the rest so that you do not have to waste your energy on doing the things that is not your calling.
I love that.
Yeah.
So this is a service that you provide for podcasters.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Well, we're going to talk about that toward the end, but the links to contact Kristin are going to be in the show notes. So if this is something that you're already thinking, man, I got to get on a call with her, we're going to have that link for you. I've heard you talk about pod fade. What can you tell listeners about that who may not be familiar with that term?
So pod fade is when you have been podcasting for a while, maybe you're 8 months in, 18 months in, and you're like, I don't know what else to podcast about. I'm done. I'm burned out. If you notice yourself like making excuses or saying, well, I'll just skip this week, and then it turns into 3 weeks, and then it turns into like, oh, I forgot I had a podcast. That is pod fade. And my heart, I actually just had a conversation this last week with a woman who started her podcast 8 months ago. And she was like, Kristin, I want to quit. And I was like, no, don't quit. If I could just like come into your room and just grab your hands and be like, don't quit. You've put so much into this. And the reason why pod fade happens is that there's not a plan in place. We have not created a sustainable structure to be able to create freely. And again, I'm a big advocate for where is your energy going? And so with this particular client, it's looking at what are you doing that is wasting your energy and allowing this burnout to happen? Do you have rest? Do you have time in between recording podcasts? Or are you scrambling at the last minute trying to get something? Do you need to take it back a little bit and communicate to your audience of, hey, you know what? I'm only going to do 2 episodes a month. It's going to be the 1st and the 15th. So there's so many tools that we can do to rekindle that flame that you'd had in the very beginning. And it's just like, I was thinking about this the other day of, it's just like when you start working out, right? And you're like, oh, I'm going to do this 5 days a week, and I'm going to eat all my vegetables, and I'm going to drink all the water. And like day 2, you're, oh no, I didn't drink all the water. I barely ate a vegetable, and I don't feel like working out. And so similar to podcasting. There's a time when motivation is not going to be there. There's going to be a time where your enthusiasm is like, oh, I really feel like I have nothing to say. And it's when we have created structure, we've created a game plan for when that happens. We've created places for rest and rejuvenation and refilling of your bucket that we can prevent that from happening. And so that's a little bit about pod fade and how to counteract the pod fade.
You know, one of the things that intrigued me when I first started listening to your show was your encouragement that so many people need to have a podcast, that they have a voice and they have a message and they need to share that. That was interesting to me. So what would you say to those who are listening who are like, I don't know. I mean, do I really need a podcast? What would you say to that?
Yeah. Oh, okay. This is getting on my high horse here. Okay. So I mainly work with a lot of coaches. So, I mean, the number of coaches that I've worked with is unreal, and they all are very similar niches, right? But every single one of those coaches has a different flavor. That's what I call it. Yeah. Whatever flavor they bring behind the mic, they're going to bring a different style. Some are more, I'm going to be very direct and tell you to get your booty in line. And then there's some that are very much like, I want to just hold space and share a story about my own journey. And then there's the ones that are, I mean, like everybody has a different way. So when you're shopping, quote unquote, for a coach, one of the best ways you can say is, hey, go check out my podcast. You can listen to how I interact with people. Maybe there's a episode where I'm actually coaching somebody and you can hear me coaching and what my coaching style is. And so that's just one little nugget of really honing in on coaches. And there is unique voices in every single one of those. So now you take an entrepreneur, like your leadership, like you are making this podcast specific to your personality, your style, what you love, versus Andy Stanley and the way that he does leadership and sermons and all of those things. But you're both leadership. And I'm thinking of like Dave Ramsey and, all these other big leader podcasters. But they're all very different. And we get to hear all these different stories, all tones of voice. And yeah, I just think it's a big opportunity for anyone who has a business, who has a passion, who has a ministry, has a coaching business, network marketing. I mean, it's such a brilliant way to put yourself out there for people to get to know you. And really, ultimately, it's that know, trust, like factor.
It's so fascinating to hear you talk about that, because by virtue of what I do, working at a local church, pastoring at a local church, I've been on podcasts, for 20 plus years. But the idea of doing one like this was one that I kept pushing off. And I just kept saying, oh, I don't know. Nobody will listen to that. Nobody cares. And you just keep pushing it off until this year. And I started listening to a number of different voices, one of which was yours, through the Wholistic Podcasting show that you have, that really spoke encouragement and say, no, now's the time. And so I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm glad that it's been an encouragement for you. I'm glad that you're doing this show. I mean, it is needed. So I was going to ask you, what was the deciding moment of, yeah, I'm doing it this year?
It was this summer. Actually, I had intended to launch it in June, and I didn't, for a number of reasons, stuff going on around in my life, and ended up launching it in August. And the catalyst for me was I wanted people to hear. I published a book that came out in January this year. And I'd been going on so many different podcasts. I've been on about 70 different shows as a guest this year since we did a podcast book tour, right? And so like interacting with so many different hosts and learning so much through that process really kind of got me started thinking about it again. Like maybe I need to rethink this. And over the summer, I started to think, what would it be like if we had a show where I could spotlight interviews and spotlight different leaders who are in such a wide variety of fields, from a podcasting coach to a bank president, everything in between, like leaders in all these different fields who are making a difference, for people to understand that leadership doesn't have to look the same, but there are principles. There are principles that run through every one of these stories. And if we will stop and listen and learn, we can benefit from the experiences of other people. And so that's what really birthed in me for the show. And I said, okay, it's time. It's time. So it was all of that coming together this year, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I love that. And I can't wait to hear more from you. And you, like, speaking of your actual voice, it's so soothing. You do have a great podcast voice. So keep going, because it's very like calming to hear you speak. So yes.
Kristin, you talk so openly about your faith on your podcast and in this interview, and how that influences every part of your life. How has your faith impacted your business and your coaching?
Well, I wouldn't have started my business without my faith. I mean, really, the whole reason why I started my business is because of my whole experience with my faith. I really didn't know who I was until I walked through that season of life. And all of this was birthed through my experience with Jesus. So I couldn't not have this be a part of my business. So yeah.
That.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping up, if you could share one piece of advice with the leaders who are listening to this podcast, what would that piece of advice be?
Never stop working on your own stuff. I think we are, when you think about whether you're leading kids, you're leading clients, you're leading your team, community, whatever aspect, if you're not doing your own work, people know. And there's depth that comes with that. And I can certainly know in my own experience, the coaches that have and mentors that have meant the most to me were the ones that have gone through the hard work of lots of healing, lots of self-discovery, lots of reading, lots of learning. So I think it really boils down to be a constant learner of yourself and a constant learner of others, and continuing to do the work. So
it's so good, so helpful. I know our listeners are going to want to stay connected with you, Kristin. What is the best way for them to do that?
Oh, I would love if you are interested in doing a podcast to come and follow me on my show on Wholistic Podcasting. Listen to the shows that Dr. William here has been talking about, and start with those, or listen to the latest episode of what's coming out. I would love for you to just take a listen, and in that you can also contact me through the show notes in that, or find me on Instagram at Kristin Chadwick.
And we will have all of those links in the show notes. Kristin, thank you so much again for your generosity today in sharing so much of the insight that you have gained over the years with our listeners.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for this episode today. As we wrap up, I have a couple of requests for you. I'd love for you to do two things. First, subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. And if you find value here, I'd love it if you would rate it and review it. That really does make a difference in helping other people to find this podcast. Second, if you don't have a copy of my newest book, Catalytic Leadership, I'd love to put a copy in your hands. If you go to catalyticleadershipbook.com, you can get a copy for free. Just pay the shipping so I can get it to you, and we'll get one right out. My goal is to put this into the hands of as many leaders as possible. This book captures principles that I've learned in 20 plus years of coaching leaders in the entrepreneurial space, in business, government, nonprofits, education, and the local church. You can always connect with me on LinkedIn to keep up with what I'm learning and thinking about. And if you're ready to take a next step with a coach who can help you to intentionally grow and thrive as a leader, I'd be honored to help you. Just go to catalyticleadership.net to book a call with me. And stay tuned for our next episode next week. Until then, as always, leaders, choose to be catalytic.
Thanks for listening to Catalytic Leadership with Dr. William Attaway. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss the next episode. Want more? Go to catalyticleadership.net.